Okay, let's reconvene, please, if you would. Make your way to your seats, and we'll restart. Sorry it wasn't that much time for lunch. Maybe some of you will continue with your lunch. But if so, come on back and have a seat so we can get started. This is the violence panel discussion. And the first speaker in the violence panel discussion is Emily Rothman. She's going to be talking about, well, this is her title, I'm not from here and I'm not the expert, trying to not have what it doesn't take to be a successful CBPR researcher, which is a great title. Emily's an associate professor of community health sciences, pediatrics, and emergency medicine at Boston University, and a visiting scientist at the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. Her 70 peer-reviewed publications address intimate partner violence, including dating violence and sexual assault, human trafficking, firearm violence, and pornography. Her support over the past 8 years or so for this work has been from NIH, several foundations, the National Institute of Justice, and she's consulted for the World Health Organization, the CDC, State Departments of Public Health, and coalitions of domestic violence programs. And she's given invited lectures around the world from Harvard and Hopkins and BU, of course, to St. Andrews in Scotland and Padova University in Italy. She and her work have been featured on The Today Show, NPR, CNN, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and for her expertise on dating violence in 17 magazine. Professor Rothman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Dean Galea and to Rich for hosting this forum and to all of you for being here today. I wanted to say that I'm grateful to be joined, so my time will be shared with my colleague from the Boston Public Health Commission. So she was sort of a late addition, and although she's not listed in the program, we'll be able to introduce you to her as well. What I wanted to do is basically tell you briefly my own story of working in community-based participatory research and how it's been for me. But before I did that, I thought I would explain what the title of my talk means. Basically, to me, engaging in community-based participatory research is innately an awkward setup. So you're bringing in someone who's supposed to be an expert from a university into a community that's having problems, and our expectation is that somehow these two elements are going to mesh together right away. And especially if the researcher is white and privileged, which are both things that apply to me, making that assumption and not grappling with it and not addressing it can really make the whole thing fall apart. So when I am in the community setting, even though I have gone to school and I've studied science and program design, I have a mantra that I just say to myself the whole time through every meeting, which is, you are not the expert. You are not from here. Because making sure that this is the other half of my title, trying to not have what it doesn't take, for me, I feel like it's just try to de-acquisition, give away, get rid of all those big pieces of knowledge which basically encumber me, that could make me think like, oh, I know what to do, I know what should happen here scientifically, and that just gets in the way, actually, of a productive process. So for me, that's sort of my mantra, or what I try to tell myself when I'm doing the work. So my story is that when I was in school, I took a class in program evaluation, and I loved it. Like, this really spoke to me. All the X's and O's and the design, different kinds of designs for evaluating programs. I really loved this stuff, and I couldn't wait to get out there and do it. But I had a teacher, and she is now a dean and professor at the Charles R. Drew University College of Medicine. But at the time, she was the professor of public health practice and associate dean for diversity at the Harvard School of Public Health. She was also the commissioner of public health for Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for a while. But in 1997, she was my teacher. And she taught me more about how to do community-based participatory research and to do these evaluation projects that I've been fortunate to do in the community than any class I took. And the way that she did it, there were two things that really stand out in my mind. So the first one was, There was an orientation at my school, and what she decided to do was invite a bunch of teenagers from the Mission Hill neighborhood to get up on this big quad in front of all of the new graduate students, and they played really loud music, and they were teaching us an aerobics class. And all of us, the students, we had to try to do, follow their movements and do exactly what they were doing. We felt really silly. And then the next thing that happened is she took us on a walk through Mission Hill. And we felt, we were mostly white, group of students, very conspicuous, walking in a line through Mission Hill. But she was adamant that you aren't just going to learn how to do this stuff by sitting in a classroom. You have to get out in the neighborhood, and I'm going to take you into the neighborhood and make you do that. So she took us out into the neighborhood, and we got to experience what that was like. And then the second thing that happened was that I really liked her. So I hung around the practice office a lot, hoping that I would get to do whatever she was doing or just be around her. She had a Christmas party one year, and mostly she invited the staff from the practice office, but she invited like a few students, and I was one of the students who got to go to her house and go to this Christmas party. And I was really excited. It was a great party. In the beginning, there was just like people having food and drinks and milling around, and it was cool. And then after a while, she was like, okay, everybody stop. We're gonna go into the living room, and we're all gonna sing Christmas carols. So I was like, well, okay. This meant there wasn't like a choice. It was like every single person at the party goes into the living room, and not only were we singing, we were gonna be clapping and like doing this with gusto. So there was a couple problems here. First of all, I can't sing at all. So I felt really worried. Second of all, I'm Jewish, and I didn't know the words to all the Christmas carols. Like, this is not my culture. And third of all, I'm actually really shy. And this idea of having to like sing and clap in front of people that I don't know made me really anxious. But there was no way that you could just suddenly leave Deborah Prothero-Stith's house in the middle of this party when everybody else was gathered around and ready to sing. So I did it. I did the singing. And I had to look like I was cool with it, too, while I was doing it, even though I wasn't really cool with it. And that's the thing that I take with me into every community-based participatory research meeting. That feeling of like, I feel really awkward, and I know I don't belong here. And this isn't my culture, and people are singing, but I don't know if I can sing with them. Like that feeling, like being okay with that feeling, that is what I bring with me when I go in to do community-based participatory research. So this is a picture of me working on one of my first community-based participatory research projects, which was a youth gang violence prevention project funded by a Byrne grant from the Department of Justice in Haverhill-Methuen. And what I learned from this project is that the people in the community don't all get along with each other. This is the number one rule of CBPR for me anyway, is that you walk into a room, you're dealing with interpersonal tensions between different factions and different groups, and so you got to learn how to like navigate that. That was not something that they taught in graduate school, right? When you're learning your odds ratios and your whatever, like, help people in a room all get along who don't necessarily like each other. And then the other thing was that there's no money. Like there wasn't, and so everybody's sort of infighting and scrapping over funds because it was really hard to get them, and that creates a tremendous amount of pressure that you have to navigate. This is the project that I'm on that my colleague will tell you about as well. So I'm on another Byrne grant. This one is in Dorchester. There have been 2 homicides in the past week in Dorchester in the neighborhood of Bowdoin, Geneva. And so this project has a lot of meaning to me, and it has a lot of meaning to the people, I think, who are working on it. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when I'm doing community-based, I'm in that room. We're sitting around in chairs. It's a church that lets us use their room, and we have sticky notes that we put up, and we use magic markers, and we're trying to grapple with the fact there were just 2 homicides in the past week, and we're going to stop that or fix it, and we're going to do it by having conversations in this room. And I bring the science. But the thing is, so this is part of the science I bring, if I stand up and I show everyone a map, like, okay, here's a map of the neighborhood and where the aggravated assaults have been in the neighborhood so we can make a plan or a strategy that is data informed. But then I don't want to just show the bad things, I want to show the assets. We pay attention to the assets of a neighborhood too, so I show, well, this was a community survey about positive collective efficacy. I show those things, and people appreciate that I brought those things, but then they look at each other and they're like, okay, now back to the real conversation. And I mean, not entirely. They appreciate them and they want to incorporate them and fold them into what they're doing. But it's really hard to go from looking at me with my map and with my survey about collective efficacy to how do we move this into an actual strategy, a data-informed strategy, so that we're doing something that's evidence-based and makes sense to the community. So I guess the lessons that I would say that I have learned in doing community-based participatory research is that it is a true partnership, and you have to make room for it to be awkward and to hold on to the idea of rigor, because rigor is important, but also make room for qualitative data and for other practice-based evidence and other ways of knowing. And that seems to me some of the most important ways of getting the job done. So I'm going to step aside because I have a colleague who works on this project with me in Bowdoin, Geneva. Kimberly Langhorne-Harrell is here. She is MSW and works at the Boston Public Health Commission and also a resident of the neighborhood where we're doing this work. And so I wanted to hear a little bit from her too about what it's like from her side working on this project. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Emily pointed out, my name is Kimberly Langhorne-Harrell, and I'm a clinician at the Boston Public Health Commission. I work in the Division of Violence. The program that I work under is called Village in Progress, which is a violence intervention prevention initiative strategy that is under the Boston Public Health. And, excuse me, I've been at the Boston Public Health Commission for about 5.5 years. I received my MSW from Simmons in 2010, and I also have a Master's in Human Service Administration from Springfield College. And I guess my background, first of all, is a community organizer. I've been a community organizer probably about 20 years, and it started in the neighborhood, the Dudley Street area neighborhood of Roxbury, Dorchester, North Dorchester. And for me, it started one day going to a Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative meeting, and from there, starting to participate in family engagement outings. And a lot of times I would hear people say, why aren't people coming out? Why aren't residents coming out? Where are they? Where are they? And from then it started really, for me personally, I'm like, there's a reason why people are not coming out to the meetings, right? And there's a reason why things keep happening, the violence uptake, and our schools going downward. So I'm gonna fast forward it a little bit, and that's when I decided to get a clinical lens and decided to get my clinical degree. And from then had an understanding of the various reasons why families were not coming out, either having to work 2 jobs, and these meetings didn't offer childcare or, or offer a second language. So in speeding it up, as I graduated Simmons, I became exposed to the public health field. And it was a different eye to me. I'm not a public person. I'm learning. I've been there, as I said, like 5.5 years. But I always came with a social justice lens and a trauma-informed lens. So when we talk about, the public health piece, I see the importance of it, but I'm also at the same time looking at that individual social and emotional well-being and the reasons why community violence is taking place. So I started, first of all, I'm gonna switch because I've been exposed to many different hats when it comes to research. As a resident, we did work with we did have researchers come to DSNI and talk about data. Here's the data. Here's where residents are engaged, or here's where they're doing. And it kind of it did go over my head. I had no interest in that. You know, I wanted to know, what are we gonna do to address the issues going on in the neighborhood? What are we gonna do? Like, how are we gonna get our politicians to pay attention to us? That's where my head was. So as time went on, wearing that hat, I'm like, no one's taking the time out to explain the data. And really, and also not only that is, once researchers have collected that data, they didn't come back and say what was about. I worked in a community neighboring mine where there was a team of researchers that came in and took a bunch of data with the residents and families and did not come back. And those, the residents and families of this neighborhood, they have never forgot till this very day, and nor should they. So to me, when we're talking about doing research in communities of color, communities with different cultures, different languages, these are the things we have to me, just being mindful of who we are interacting with, how we are interacting with them, and the follow-up piece. Because I've heard words such as guinea pigs. You know, I'm not a guinea pig. These things are happening to me. You know, the social determinants, they're happening. And it's like, why am I being looked under a stethoscope, excuse me. But with all that being said, from that perspective, it taught me in going forward, when talking about research, to be very mindful of talking about when the research, you know, when it's going to take place, what that timeline looks like, what does the follow-up look like, the timeline of the follow-up, and what is it going to look like. Whereas we are all going to understand the outcomes of the data and the importance of it. Just starting this burn, and I don't have words to describe, but it's like something that I've always been asking for when it comes to research. You know, let us sit down, what is going to happen, which Emily's team has been really, really thorough at explaining, you know, what's going to happen. I'm not the expert because but they're engaged, they're eating with us, they're playing with babies, you know, they're interacting, and at the same time, they're taking the time to explain. They're taking the time to explain what research is, the purpose of it, and you know, not knowing the outcome, but you know, letting folks know that we're going to come back together and share the outcomes. I think that, to me, looking at the trauma-informed lens, that is, with the residents being trauma-informed, and again, my famous MO is do no harm, you know, because when we talk about research, we can do harm. So I say these things in a sense of there's so much I wanted to say, but I think thinking about relationships when coming into the communities, that it takes time to build that trust, as I'm sure you've been hearing all throughout your day, but knowing that there are communities that have been hurt by research, because of research, and that they could be leery, but I can't stress more from my experience that it does take being around that circle. It does take it helps to have those sticky notes, and it does take a lot of time to just sit back and to hear what the families and residents have to say, and not just talking to or just handing papers with charts, but really going over what those charts are all about and what we hope to be able to address, you know, whether it's policies or procedures, how we can advocate, being able to take that information and possibly advocate to our politicians. So that's the hope that I see in this.
Okay, thank you very much. In this panel, we're going to go from each presentation and then have the questions and discussion in the panel at the end. Our next speaker is Phillip Graham. And Phillip, Professor Graham, will talk about addressing trauma exposure among boys and men of color, the case for optimal development. Now, Dr. Graham is Director of Drugs, Violence, and Delinquency Prevention Research Program, the Center for Justice, Safety, and Resilience at RTI International. He has over 20 years of experience conducting community-based research and evaluation using mixed methods. He's focused on the prevention of adolescent interpersonal violence, social capital, ethnic identity, and community violence and substance use. He's currently directing large-scale national cross-site evaluations of communities' efforts to reduce substance use and related problems using, and leading efforts to develop an evaluation toolkit for communities, and studying measures of community social cohesion and shared values for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Initiative. Dr. Graham.
Good afternoon. That won't work. I come from rural North Carolina, Southern Baptist, and so this is about call and response. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Much, much better. So first I want to thank both Dr. Galea and Saltz for giving me here, but I most want to thank Kalpita because she's, how should I say, rolled out a red carpet and also promoted me. So I am not Professor Graham. So I am the only non-academic at this conference giving a presentation. And so each one of the emails says Professor Graham. I said, well, I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn, but I did stay at the Hotel Commonwealth last night. And so maybe I will be professorial today. This has been an amazing conference, and so I was coming here trying to figure out what lessons I could provide to you, but I decided actually this will be a learning opportunity. And so the first thing I've learned when I get back, I'm changing the name of my program because I realize that I do community health science. And so my team has 3 clinical psychologists, 2 behavioral psychologists, 2 developmental psychologists, 3 public health. So when I read your manifesto, I said, this is what we do, so thank you very much. What I want to do today is really spend some time talking about something and that's near and dear to me. And so for the last 20 or more years, I've really focused on this issue around the impact of exposure to violence. My dissertation really focused on it. And that was based on my work early in California during the early 1990s when black-on-black crime was at an all-time high. In doing that, I want to do a couple things, though. First, I want to combine a thought, a story, some data, but really I have more questions than answers. And hopefully when we get to the dialogue opportunity, you will actually tell me how good or how poorly I did in threading this needle about the presentation. You will also see I modified the title, and so again, really my famous 2 words, anyone who's worked with me, is context matters. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today is context as it relates to boys and men of color and exposure to trauma. So, as you know, a couple things in terms of exposure to violence, particularly among boys and men of color. Most of you should be familiar with ACE, for example, a study conducted in 2013 looking at mostly African Americans and Hispanics, and that 4 out of 5 young adults had reported at least 1 ACE in their lifetime. But over almost 50% reported multiple ACE. And that's really about the number of times in which you're exposed to adverse childhood exposure that leads to subsequent poor negative outcomes in the future. In addition, when we think about community violence and exposure, really looking at 2005, African Americans, 800,000, that number always blows me away. Nonviolent crimes, 8,000 homicides, 85% which were males. More recently, looking at CDC, and of course, between the ages of 15 and 34, leading cause of death is homicide among African American males. So really that provides the context in really talking about understanding what are the important things that we need to understand from a prevention standpoint as we address these issues. And so the story I want to tell you is this, and I don't know if you can see this. On the right, that's an Instagram picture, and I want to talk about my 50-50 kid. There's a young man who's 13 years old who I've been mentoring since he was 5. And I call him my 50-50 kid because he can use an incredible intellect for good or bad, depending on which path he takes. And so I've been dedicated to really figuring out how to be an influence in his life, and during our discussion, I'll tell you about some of the outcomes. But the real question and what I want to talk about today is two things. One, with respect to exposure to violence and trauma, the first question is, how can we change the environment? How can we eliminate that exposure? If we cannot eliminate that exposure, then the other question is, what are the roles of social constructs and even human interaction in terms of how we respond to trauma exposure? And that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. And in the context of social capital. You guys have just met me, so you don't really know me, but I'm a skeptic. And as you know, words like social capital, collective impact, even community social science sometimes can feel like buzzwords. And the question is, are they really substantively different than what's been done in the past? And so one of those concepts is social capital. For a while, the panacea of all things wrong. And so if you had social capital, it would solve all problems. And what it really looks at, two important things. The first, of course, is the issue around really relationships. The difference is, beyond things like mentoring, is relationships that provide access to resources, and that's really the big difference. So if someone says, well, I have a mentoring program that's social capital, not. That's only step one. The bigger issue is about this access to resources and opportunities. And there are different types of social capital. That can be bonding, bridging, and linking. What I was interested in is whether or not that can tell us anything about levels of exposure in communities and how we might develop interventions based on that. So some of the key aspects include the following. First is the issue of trust, sense of belonging, and participation. So these are ingredients, and if done in a very cohesive way, really end up developing what I call social capital. But again, it's about access to resources and opportunities. So what I want you to do is to try to figure out, could we test this empirically? There's lots that have been written theoretically, but not really much empirically. And so what we did was combine a couple pieces of data. So we took the Social Capital Community Benchmark Survey that was actually, comes from Robert Putnam's work, and really trying to think, is there a place in North Carolina where I could combine that data? And so that the data was weighted such in a way that we could look at combining data sources. So we took that data and combined it with police data and really looked at issues of violence and crime in the community, overlaying that with the Social Capital Benchmark Survey. Identified about 70 tracts that had both social capital data and where they'd oversampled in this region around the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area. So, in terms of data, we looked at violent crime. And that's all violent crimes per 1,000 residents, aggravated assaults, rapes, homicide, robberies, as well as property crime. Again, looking, is there a relationship, and is a relationship that really helps us understand aspects of social capital. So in terms of those social capital variables, and like most surveys, it wasn't specifically designed for this. And this is one of the issues in terms of really, how do we use archival data to answer really complex questions? And so we had to do a little retrofitting, but there are a couple things that we thought approximated some of the key aspects and concepts as it relates to social capital. Those included the following: the sense of belonging, and that's really looking at people reporting on whether people in the neighborhood, places of worship, or people that share ethnic backgrounds have a sense of community. The second was trust, and that's really looking at to what degree and extent people in the neighborhoods can be trusted, whether places of worship can be trusted, as well as whether local police can be trusted. And given some of the issues between community and policing right now, it really adds to, what is that relationship to us as it relates to communities and police. Also, an effectiveness of community and neighborhood cooperation. So those are the variables we tried to look at in measuring aspects of social capital in relationship to violence and crime. Here's a map where we kind of looked at, you see the red spots were the highest crime areas. And so again, I won't show you all the data slides since 10 minutes is not a lot of time. And so I've been working on really staying to that time and getting it done. But I think we're in a good place. So what we did is we used a standard stepwise and a backwards regression models to really look at the relationship between these indicators of violence and crime and relationship to social capital. And what you see here, and the big take-home message, and I'll dig down, is that the thing that was most significant is the issue of trust. So if I just summarize it, most of the social capital variables were not significantly correlated with crime rates in general. However, the issue of, with the exception of trust, And so as I listened to Nina's presentation the other day, I said, this is, and much of what we've talked today has come together very nicely, and you will see all of these kind of cross-pollination of themes. This issue of trust is important. And so it was significant for all except for homicide, but really in terms of covariance, it's one predictor for all four types of crimes, as well as really increases, and one increase in percentage of trust had a significant reduction in both violent crime and property crime. And also it was significantly different with these strong predictors. So then the question became, what do we do with these kinds of findings? We're really beginning to think about how we might interact with communities in terms of reducing both violent exposure, by reducing these opportunities, and more importantly, how we might address these issues once one has been exposed to violence. So I want to bring this back to this context matters and talk about my 50-50 kid. And so part of that story is that he now lives with me. And so I was an empty nester for a whole week. And so now I have an 8th grader who I have taken joint legal custody and flown him from Connecticut because he'd moved away. And so he now lives in my house. And so just when I was about to downsize and sell it, I have a 13-year-old African-American male, and I've raised 2 African-American daughters. So that's a whole new experience for me. But I did that because when I talk about making those decisions, and so the reason he lives with me is because he was about to get expelled for bringing a fake gun to school that looked real, and so you think about Tamir Rice and the like. So there's a pivotal point in his life at 13 years old that I could have let him go to reform school, or I opened up my house. And so that gets back to the issue of trust. And so before he left, he was a model student, and so last year he spent 7th grade with me, and he went from D's and F's to all A's and B's, and so in a 6-month period. And so when I sent him back to his mom this summer, he got in one fight, so I brought him back, and so he's here with us again. So here's the important piece. As we think about boys and men of color and these issues that have to deal with exposure to violence and opportunities for success, the first is who cares about and for them matters. And that gets back to the issue of trust. And so our relationship is built on trust in terms of what he does and what he doesn't do and the consequences of those and his opportunities for future success. In addition to that, the manner in which communities address his well-being matters. So when we talk about individuals who've been exposed to violence in a community context, how do we think about incorporating aspects of trust in both our interventions and how we address communities in terms of being a part of that process? And the last, his access to opportunities and resource matters. So, and the thing that binds and ties all this together is community. And so while I am an applied researcher, understanding the importance of community is how we begin to really change outcomes. And I am a proponent of random clinical trials, but I also know that once we move from that spot and do this work in a real world context, all of those controls go away. So really our job as community intervention scientists is to figure out, once we learn what potentially works in a very controlled setting, how do we ensure it works in a real world setting? And I think that's the challenge, and the challenge I would make to BU in terms of what does it mean to be a community health science program. And really the importance at the end of the day is not how many publications, I know you guys need to get tenure, but it's really about how we change the outcomes in communities. Because at the end of the day, and I think Dr. Kaplan nailed on the head, we can do all this work and we can write all these articles, but if we aren't changing community outcomes, then we are not doing something correct. And so in closing, I'll say, here's what we need to do, right? Understanding how trust develops among community residents is an important part of the development of community-level interventions to reduce trauma exposure. Also, understanding how trust operates and develops among different groups in different community contexts will begin to move us in the right direction, really training the trajectory of young people and the outcomes of communities. With that, I think I have 3 minutes, but you said we weren't doing questions. But I want to thank you for, 1, inviting me, 2, for this opportunity to really talk about how the work we do really begins to change the outlook for communities. And so social capital is just one of those concepts for really understanding how access to resources and the role of caring adults can potentially be key indicators to successful outcomes among young people, particularly boys and men of color. So thank you.
Thank you for helping us make up a couple minutes. Next, innovating gang violence prevention with machine learning and qualitative methods. I don't know if I've heard machine learning and qualitative methods in the same sentence before. Desmond Patton is assistant professor, School of Social Work, Columbia University, and a faculty affiliate of the Social Intervention Group and the Data Science Institute. He uses qualitative and computational data collection methods to examine how and why gang violence, trauma, grief, and identity are expressed on social media and the real-world impact they have on well-being for low-income youth of color. His research on internet banging has been discussed nationally on media outlets, including the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, NPR, Boston Magazine, ABC News, and many more. He also provides expert witness testimony using social media during court trials. His work has also been disseminated in over 30 peer-reviewed publications, and he was recently cited in an amicus curiae brief submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court, which examined the issues of interpreting threats on social media. So let's hear from Professor Patton.
Good afternoon. It is so great to be here with you all today to learn from you all and to talk about my research on internet banging. I'm a social worker, and I'm interested in the ways in which young people use social media to tell their stories about life in their communities. And through those narratives, I've learned a lot about community violence, about trauma and stress. And by working with data scientists, we've been able to create algorithms that can detect and predict that content online. And so I'm going to talk about a case study that we did last summer in which we used machine learning and qualitative analysis to detect aggression and loss in Twitter data from a gang-involved youth in Chicago. Just by way of introduction, I direct the SAFE Lab at Columbia School of Social Work, where we're focused on community violence research. And this academic year, I'm a fellow at the Berkeley Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. So I am around in Boston for those who want to connect and grab coffee. So this work is really a continuation of my interest in how young people navigate violence. So I did my dissertation in Chicago, a qualitative study trying to understand how young African-American men, high-achieving African-American men, navigate both violence and staying engaged in school. And then I continued that work when I entered my first academic position at the University of Michigan, and I wanted to learn more about how they're doing. And they introduced me to what was happening on Twitter. In particular, there was a beef argument between two very well-known rappers that was unfolding on Twitter. And one of those rappers identified his location and said, essentially, if you have a problem with me, meet me at this exact location. And within 3 hours, that rapper was killed in that exact location that he tweeted from. And so from that point on, I was particularly interested in how social media is used as a tool for not only leading to violence, but understanding violence as well. And so this work is based in the city of Chicago because I did my dissertation work there, but also many of you are probably familiar with Chicago because it's constantly in the news, right? And so almost every month, there's a new story about gang violence in Chicago. In the past 2 years, there's been an extreme uptick in violence, right? In particular, in the past 9 months, there have been 477 homicides in Chicago. And last year, there were 789 homicides. So we're in pace for meeting that if things do not change, and this is a huge issue. At the same time, young people, young adults, many of us are spending an enormous amount of time on social media. We're providing our personal details, things about eating and food and relationships and love, but also trauma and stress and all the challenging pieces of our lives that we're going through. For some reason, we think that social media is a great space to leave these things, to communicate these things. And so this happens a lot for young people who live in some of the most challenging and violent neighborhoods in Chicago. And so they're talking about their experiences with neighborhood violence. Who's most violent? What gang is doing what? What party is happening? And so it becomes a way of mapping out space and time and location within this space. And so our science has advanced in ways in which we know that violence is treated like a communicable disease, and that oftentimes these interactions happen through face-to-face interactions and spreads through highly dense, concentrated communities, in particular communities of color. But what happens when technology creates new communities, new ways in which people can go back and forth? And are our violence prevention methods and interventions leveraging social media as an apparatus, as a tool to understand that particular communication? So this is the focus of my work. And so in this paper, there are three research aims that I'm going to discuss. One in which we are attempting to identify and describe those offline characteristics in Twitter communication from self-identified gang members. So the things that you bring from your offline world and how you leave them on social media, and the ways in which we can use that knowledge, that information, to then understand better when and how violence may occur offline. Then we want to take those qualitative characteristics and then develop an automatic coding process for analyzing gang-related content on social media. And then we want to measure the performance of natural language processing tools on gang-related Twitter content. So I'm going to talk you through some of our processes. So I started this work about 5 years ago. What I quickly realized is that there may have been 1 or 2 papers on the relationship between gang violence and social media. And there were various methods in which I could pull from, right? Qualitative methods, surveys, computational methods, but none really helped me to be able to leverage the nuance in social media communication. In doing this work, I quickly realized I didn't know what the hell young people were saying online. In order to firmly understand this content, we needed a methodology that really sought to unpack culture and context in tweets. So that when we're saying something is potentially violent, we're not just pulling that out of our hats, because we're talking about young people of color, right? Who are marginalized, who are racialized, who already have an immense amount of pressures on them. And by identifying their content as being threatening, that could lead to future criminalization. And so we want to make sure that whatever methodologies and practices that we're using are fully unpacking the language and content in that text. And so, based on my prior research, I realized that we needed a more systematic approach to coding for situational and environmental factors that influence social media communications. As such, I developed an approach for digging deeper in social media data. This process includes identifying offline indicators like grief and trauma or affiliation, looking deeper at social media content that includes examining mood and tone in posts, and the use of emojis and hashtags, and looking at the author of the post, who follows that individual and who that person is following, and vice versa, and looking at the actual user's handle for clues and affiliation and neighborhood connections. And so this is the digital urban violence analysis approach. We start with a social media data set that we've identified, and I'll talk more about that. Our annotation process, our qualitative process, includes leveraging the input, the insights from community experts. These are young African-American men from Chicago that are research assistants in our lab who translate and interpret social media data for us. And then we have our MSW students also annotating data, but using neighborhood effects and community context lens to their annotation process. And so we're labeling Twitter data. That labeled data is then handed off to our friends in the Data Science Institute, who are computational linguists, who then take our labels, in which we provide the training data, if you will, and they use that to then predict the themes and patterns that we have found to emerge from the Twitter data. And that becomes the key for detecting those themes and patterns in the data as well. And so, as I mentioned, our research team includes 3 components that I think are vastly important. We quickly realized that in order to do this well, we needed to have community experts. We needed to understand the language and the context. What we found is that oftentimes the tweets were hyper-localized, and so there are mentions of blocks and streets and gang connections and schools and neighborhoods that if you're not from that exact block, that exact community, you're not going to understand what's happening. And so we hired research assistants as community experts. We found these young men through our partnerships at the YMCA in Chicago. We have a paper about the process of working with community experts, because as we've learned today, this is not an easy process. And to involve young people, to involve community members in the research should not be done lightly, should not be treated lightly. And so we made a lot of mistakes because, as you all probably understand, their lives were happening. They were experiencing violence on a day-to-day basis. They were dealing with family traumas and school traumas and a vast amount of things that were impacting their ability to work in the lab, but they did the best they could, and we were able to leverage their voices immensely. And our social work team then takes those translations and interpretations from the young people and then looks for higher level qualitative things in the data, and then we pass it off to our data science team. And so the case study that I'm going to talk about is from Jakara Barnes. I learned about Jakara Barnes because her story made headline news in 2014. I was sitting at my desk at the University of Michigan, and this headline came flashing across my screen: the teen gun-toting gang queen of Chicago. And I was like, well, who is that, and what does that mean? And then I dug deeper into the story to learn that Jakara Barnes was killed at 17 years old. But before, and she was heavily involved in gangs, the Gangster Disciple gang on the south side of Chicago. But there was so much more to her life that the story did not tell. What we found out is that she was quite prolific on Twitter. She had around 5,000 followers, around 27,000 tweets in 3 years, which put her in the 98th percentile of Twitter users. And she was tough. She was known as a hitter or a shooter in her gang. By the time she was 17, she had allegedly shot or killed up to 20 people. So this is someone not to be taken lightly. But once you dug deeper into her Twitter, you realize that this is also a young woman who experienced an immense amount of pain and trauma and grief. And every time someone in her gang or crew or family or school was shot or killed, she emoted online and expressed that grief. And so what was really helpful for me in terms of checking my own biases is that I realized that I entered the research thinking, okay, I'm going to identify all the content online that can predict future violence. But what I realized is that these are whole people, and these are young people that are bringing their whole selves, and I'm learning a lot about root causes of violence through their connections to Twitter. And that it's more important to tell a more robust story about the lives of young people of color than to just be picking out a particular content that we might deem as threatening or violent. And so in this particular study, we identified 800 tweets that we wanted to focus on. We picked a time period of 2.5 weeks in which there were 2 events that unfolded. The first event is when Jakara Barnes lost a good friend, Little B, to gun violence. He was shot and killed by the Chicago police. And then 2.5 weeks later, 2 weeks later, she was killed by a rival gang. And so we wanted to understand first how she would react to her friend's death, to see if there were any forms of retaliation and how she would grieve in that process. And then we wanted to see how her friends would react to her death. And so going back to the methodology, we always start off with our community experts who interpret and translate data. They provide cultural and linguistic insights and validate the social work coding. And so, for example, in the first tweet, which is kind of hard to see, it says, if we see an op, fuck them, we're gonna smoke them. And so we really need to understand some of the content in this tweet. In particular, we need to understand what the term op meant. And so from our community experts, we quickly realized that op was short for opposition, and this could be an oppositional gang, crew, or clique, or the police as well. With our social annotation process, each tweet is annotated twice by a group of annotators, and combinations of annotators rotate through a user every 100 tweets. Our content experts, who are our youth, our community experts, review their own set of randomly chosen tweets. Tweets are then compared within groups and between groups for agreement, compared between annotators and the content experts. And then any disagreement in the annotator group is resolved during weekly coding meetings. And those disagreement tweets, the ones that we cannot agree on, are kicked to our community experts. So before anything is labeled, our community experts, our youth, are the ones making the final decisions on how we're categorizing and labeling data. This is an example of our annotation system that we use. We spend a lot of time thinking about threat and how we assess threat, and so our annotators have a toggle bar that they can move between 0 to 1, 0 being non-threatening, 1 being extremely threatening, and so they're looking at a tweet and trying to make sense of level of threat. And then there's what we call our qualitative box, where they have to unpack why they've assigned a particular tweet as threatening or not. And so when we're looking through a tweet, we again have a systematic process. We look at the text, the emojis and hashtags. We look at any links or images in that tweet. We go to the original post on Twitter and we see who the poster is, if anyone is tagged in that post. We see if there's any offline events that are referenced. We see if the tweet, we look at how many times the tweet has been retweeted or reshared, and to see if there are any replies or comments or any conversations that have unfolded from that tweet as well. So let's take an example of an aggression tweet that we found. So let's take a look at this post. So Jakara writes, "Don't get caught on the 800 block, lame ass. Better take that shit on Stony Spot." So how many of you understand what's happening in this tweet? Raise your hand. Okay. So in an example like this, we need to understand why Jakara is directing someone not to be present on 800 block. And so we pull things out like 800 block and Stony Spot and ask, what's the significance? And based on our research and from our community experts, we realized that 800 block and Stony Spot represent 2 distinct gang territories on the south side of Chicago, and that Jakara is directing the group indirectly on how to navigate space based on what she deems is appropriate for them. We also found a significant amount of grieving posts. And what's most interesting about this is that oftentimes expressions of loss and grief come before more aggressive posts. And also, what you might also see is the use of emojis. And these are used heavily to amplify or to better explain text. So the first example, "That's my blood, left him in cold blood." The use of the cop, the pig, and the cop car emoji gives you clear indication of who she is referencing and who she thinks is responsible for the death. But then the sad face and the praying hands are clear indications of grief, and these are oftentimes used to express loss and grief. And so from our qualitative processes, we found 3 important things, one being aggression, which includes insults, threats, bragging, etc., grief and loss, so that's distress, sadness, and loneliness, and then other, which is all the amazing things that we all talk about, to include relationships, love, happiness, that kind of thing. But for the purposes of this particular study, we focus on aggression and loss. And so again, as I mentioned, this is all used to inform our work with our data scientists. And so we provide the labeled data set, and then they use the labeled data set and apply machine learning using supervised and semi-supervised techniques to then detect and predict content on Twitter. And so one of the things that our data scientists use is part-of-speech taggers. However, the data scientists quickly realized that this could be challenging because their machine learning tools had not been applied in this context. So one such example is the use of the word ass, which at times can be used as an adverb, adjective, or noun, whereas in standard English, ass is almost always used as a noun. And so it had no idea of how to interpret lame ass, hence why the qualitative piece was most important to help unpack this sentiment. When they used the part-of-speech tagger with our qualitative labels, they were able to identify aggression and loss with 81.5% accuracy. So this means that we get the correct part of a speech right as intended in the context 81.5% of the time, which then allows us to classify the data. And then next, our system then automatically classifies posts as aggression using an emotion lexicon or indicators of mood, translations, and part of speech. An F measure is a measure for accuracy, and so we essentially 62% of the time we're classifying aggression correctly. So we still have a lot of work to do in this space, but this is why it's really important to partner with youth and community-based organizations to help us sift through these scenarios, clusters of language that we should be paying attention to. And we continue to analyze this work over the summer. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. We have found some new paths of de-escalation that we are thinking through and analyzing. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this, but if you want to hear more, please talk to me afterwards. We've also identified new patterns of trouble sleeping related to grief as well. So 64 out of our 306 users in our current data set have talked about having trouble sleeping because of grief. And then what do we do with this, right? And so we have an R1 that's under review in which we have proposed to provide social media data to a community-based organization in Chicago as they are doing their intervention work in real time. So they would have a user interface where they would get automatic alerts to content, not people, but content in particular communities and neighborhoods that they should be paying attention to. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go right to our discussant. Our discussant is Emily Ozer, professor of community health sciences, University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health, and co-founder of the Innovations for Youth Center. Her work, reported in over 60 scientific papers, focuses on youth-led participatory research, trauma and resilience, and school-based interventions. Funders of her research include NIDA and ICHD, the William T. Grant Foundation, and the CDC. She seeks to develop equitable and sustained collaborations with community partners to challenge rigid notions of evidence and to highlight the role of multiple methods and insider expertise in understanding and changing the conditions for the positive development of marginalized adolescents and their communities. Professor Ozer.
Thanks so much. Okay, thank you. You're going to help me get in there? Great. It's such a privilege to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate it, and thank you for those excellent presentations. I wanted to, before commenting directly on the presentations, I just wanted to respond to the broader framing of this conference, which has been really stimulating. In terms of, let's see, one with my, it's Ozer's my name. Here, right there, right there. Let's start from notes from the start. So in terms of how do we define community health science, oops, okay. It's coming, okay. From the start, it looks like it's on the, okay. It's starting midway, so I can try to use, there we go. Okay. In terms of defining community health science, how do we matter? How, I think also the relationship to social epidemiology is one that this conference has made me think about. And also how do the contributing disciplines to this field and the ethical frames for how we work with communities guide what we do in public health. So I'm going to start broad and then get a little bit more specific and then have time to turn it over to you all for questions. So one of my mentors, I don't know if she can claim being original with that, but Nancy Adler at UCSF, there's hard science and then there's harder science. So I would put community health sciences in the harder science realm. I come to this dialogue, to this discussion as a psychologist from multiple subdisciplines in psychology, community, clinical, developmental, and health psychology. But really I'm going to focus on the community and developmental pieces for today. So we know, for those who've taken social epidemiology, some of the basic questions are about the importance of context, right? So Lincoln Phelan guided us in asking what puts people at risk of risks when we think about risk and protective factors, to think about the role of contexts and settings in the patterns of risk as well. So, you know, we're always in public health trying to look upstream, right? And obviously other classic work in terms of asking, you know, where's the spider in the web of causation? So we have the social ecological model, but a big piece of public health and social epidemiology in general is to sort of ask about fundamental causes and to really look at not just focus on mechanisms, which I say that
even as with training in health psychology, that really a big piece of that work is saying, let's not just ask about how stress and poverty and racism get under the skin, but let's keep looking upwards, and as a big theme of this discussion. So we have this social ecological frame in terms of how we think about well-being, in terms of how we define health. I think something that is a theme today is sort of who gets to define health and who gets to define the outcomes, and what does that look like if it's not just being defined by us, but it's being defined by the people who are actually living lives who we're working with. So we've all seen this Bronfenbrenner model many times, or many of us have seen that, in terms of really orienting us to the broader contexts and different types of contexts. But I don't want to forget that this was conceptualized as a developmental model, an ecological developmental model. And so what does this really mean for community health sciences to take development, human development, seriously? How do we think about our populations in terms of where they are developmentally? What are the tasks and challenges at that point in development, realizing that it may look different across settings, across countries, across communities, where in some cases, I work primarily with children and adolescents, and in some cases, young people are living very adult lives in terms of what they're having to cope with, I think is talked about already in this seminar. And how do human needs for autonomy and connectedness, how do our needs for identity, sense of purpose, et cetera, are relevant to the populations we work with, in addition to the domains just focused on health? So I think that's one piece I want to leave you with, is that what's the role of developmental science in community health sciences? So the contributions of psychology to community health sciences, at least as I see it as a psychologist, go beyond the social ecological frame to include classic work by community psychologists such as Jim Kelly and others on the causes of health and wellness and disease, not just the causes, but how we intervene, and how ecological principles help inform how we intervene and how we work with communities. So I won't go into these in detail given time, but I think these have really been strong themes throughout the day in terms of really understanding human development in the context of nested systems, how those systems, and when we work with people, they're in network, they're interdependent, so when we intervene in one area, it's going to have effects in other places. When we have natural disasters in Houston and Florida, how does that affect the rest of our country and the world? When there's open school lunch, and how does that connect with what's available in the neighborhood in terms of nutrition, for example? This issue of cycling of resources, that ecological principle, is also really critical to how we approach working with communities. How are we assessing the resources that are there? How are we working in such a way that we're building resources rather than taking them away? I think that's been a strong theme today. How do we understand and promote communities and populations' own ability to adapt and to develop and to use their own resources in resilience processes? And then this notion of feedback loops, which was critical to systems theory. So I think that this work on systems is very informative, not just in how we sort of understand the causes and how they interact, but how we think and the ethics of how we work with communities. So just building on that, I think from this developmental ecological perspective, prompts us to ask what are the key challenges and competencies across the life course, and how can environmental conditions and supports at particular times maximize healthy development in terms of transition or sensitive periods in the broad meaning of that term. So some of the key issues I see that we're tackling today and that community health sciences needs to tackle are how do systems and people deal with chronic stressors such as violence, as well as catastrophic shocks and stressors, like obviously so much is happening today. What resources support coping and resilience processes, and what's our role as community health scientists in not just documenting health inequalities and other kinds of inequalities, but actually reducing those inequalities. So I think this piece about ethics and social justice is very inherent, I think, or something we should be focused on. So I wanted to highlight a little bit of Dr. Patton's work. Just really, I think this work is so important in recognizing and analyzing social media as a developmental setting. It's a key setting across the lifespan, but particularly for young people in terms of how you've shown how it's sort of a way of asserting identity, connection, coping, expressing grief. And social media is often very neglected in violence prevention programs. It's, and that has to do also with sort of the cycle of how evidence-based prevention gets approved and how long it takes, but often it's sort of outdated in terms of a lot of how social media may play a role in escalating, or as you talk about in your work, also potentially helping to resolve conflicts or beefs. I think I was really struck by the rigor of your work, really taking seriously the need for meaningful interpretations of the communications, as well as really the poignancy of the grief reaction, the not sleeping, the impact on these bereft young people, and how they're using the technology to cope with their grief. So, and I think, there's certainly been a lot of attention, like the recent Atlantic article, about technology as a negative factor in terms of adolescent development, and that's certainly real, but I think also thinking about how it's used in sort of developmentally salient and positive ways for connection and support is also really important to consider. One thing I wanted to mention is I think there are so many challenges of working with social media in terms of the methodology and theory. So just if we have time to hear more about some of those challenges or how you cope with some of those challenges, because researchers I know who work in this area talk about how quickly the technology changes, and by the time you write the proposal, it's outdated, and what are they using and what aren't they using. So kind of hearing more about that would be wonderful. And so, sorry, just get here. I think the presentation that you both gave on CBPR, I just appreciate the grappling with the complexity for Emily and Kimberly, and really it's such an illustration of how those ecological principles of intervention are sort of easier said than done, but like what does it really take on a human level in terms of the connection and the relationships and how are you in the room, and so it's just really appreciated that the sort of honest reflection on that, and to think about how, how are we, going back to sort of ecological principles of resources, how are we resources in the process versus how do we get in the way? So it was, I'm going to focus on that. And then I think some of the thoughts that sparked during Dr. Graham, your presentation, I think this really strong focus on trust, and who cares about, and how does that matter, and just pondering, we know how trauma affects trust. So how you sort of think about, trust being so critical in the context of trauma, but yet also how do you sort of forge that, what does it take, what kind of conditions does it take to kind of create those trusts? And I think about the community-based organizations. I know you're just starting an RWJ-funded project on an amazing community organization in the Bay Area, and I've worked with other community-based organizations who are so skilled at creating these spaces, these sort of non-judgmental spaces where young people can come and be accepted and form relationships. And there's this kind of magic in what they do. And in my collaborative work with some of these organizations, they're really frustrated by how to measure that, because funders want to see certain kinds of outcomes, and yet they're dealing in their communities in crisis. So symptom reduction is not going to show what the magic of what they're doing. It's sort of the fact that young people are showing up and being there and having conversations and being vulnerable. So sort of how do we think about, through research practice partnerships, we can also work on these issues of measurement and indicators. And I've been actively thinking and working on that, so would love to talk with you more about that. So with that, I would like to open it up to the rest of the audience. Yeah.
Very stimulating presentations all. And I love the comment from your mentor that you have hard science and then the harder science which brings me to my question really is for Kimberly from a community partner perspective, because the one piece that we haven't really brought to bear, even though we have a lot of students in the room, I think, is how all this bears on our academic work, our the teaching mission of what we do as professors. And so, but I'm wondering from a community perspective, what would you say are the most important things for us to convey to our students about how we do this work? Just off the top of your head.
Do we need, oh, you got a mic, okay.
Being mindful of who
Can you hear in the back? Is the mic on?
here.
It's not on? Is it on? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Being mindful, I would remind the students to be mindful of who they are. What I mean by that is, you know, come from a white privileged background, walking into a underserved, under-resourced community, to be mindful of that, as well as a lot of, you know, in a lot of meetings that take place, people are sharing their stories, and they're sharing them, and it's like a twofold, because a lot of people want to help, but don't take that on. Some people just want to hear ear. Don't feel like you have to put that cape on, because there are times when we're not going to be able to help, but to be able to, maybe there might be it's the hope that there's a resource that's around that'll be able to help support that person. I think also, as I might have said before, is being culturally informed about that population, where the study is going to take place. I think right now we are working in a community that we have to be mindful of the language as well as the culture. So we're coming up with strategies and plans right now about how we can best provide the appropriate resources for this community, and being compassionate. And you're not going to know everything, and it's okay to ask questions because people appreciate that, you know, from my experience.
Oh, yeah.
Great, really rich discussion, and I thank you for that. I want to bring up a topic which I'm surprised I don't think has come up, maybe I missed it, and that is religious institutions. And we obviously want to build on the strengths in the sort of institutions which have deep roots in our communities, and in many cases, churches and mosques and synagogues fit those criteria. And I'm just curious, are they irrelevant to the way in which you're defining and operationalizing and working with with communities, and particularly for young people, for kids who do they have a set of values which just don't resonate with adolescents? So this is just a broader question of, I'm surprised religious institutions really haven't come up as something that can be leveraged in a positive way.
Does anyone want to take that?
I'll start from a measurement. So in the questions about trust, it does ask about trust in religious institutions. What we didn't do is, you know, those four types of opportunities for trust, which one was really driving that? For me, I think it's a missed opportunity until we talk about systems and systems responses. I think there has been the father of adolescents, although they wouldn't say they were adolescents, now they're 18 and 21. You know, we've struggled with the importance of going to church, and now they're at college, as an example, and saying, have you gone to church this Sunday? And these reasons about why they're too busy to do that. And so I think it goes into young people really thinking about religion in a much more intellectual way, and really and pushing back against religion too. So I think part of it is how do religious institutions also morph and change to be more responsive to looking through the lens of young people. I think they have a critical role in terms of resources, access to resources, understanding how to really maximize creating spaces that folks can come and feel safe as communities are changing. I live in a community that's been gentrified, but I go to church in a community that would be considered low resource, and that happens in many urban communities. And so what's the church's role in engaging both folks who've been there forever and folks who are feeling like they've been displaced and moving out? So from my perspective, I think the church probably has to do a better job, and I'd say, and I shouldn't say church, religious organizations, please forgive me. So religious organizations need to do a better job of figuring out how they can really retool to be more responsive to the needs of young people.
Oh, okay, see you.
I want to ask Dr. Graham a question, but I just want to respond to your question about what should you tell students. I would say, just being on both sides of the fence, I think it's important for you when you go into these, out in the field to do your research work, don't see families as subjects for a cohort. See them as people. And once you see them as people, everything else I think will fall into place. Dr. Graham, my question was, you talked about a 50-50 child, and it's great for one-on-one type of intervention. But how do you see that being a systematic intervention? What does that look like for the average child who could potentially be, could go either side of this fork in the road?
So another example, and so, and Dwelly is my one-on-one, but I'm also a member of a group called the 100 Black Men of America, and so it's a youth mentoring organization of professional African-American men. And what we really focus on in group settings is this issue around mentoring, but access to resources. And so for me, it is, and I think mobile folks have talked, it is not ever a single answer. So even when we talk about issues of mechanization, it's never a single thing. And I think part of the reason why things don't work in the real world is because we look at things one at a time. Everything we do is interrelated and complex. And so that's why systems dynamics is a way to really think about the work that we do, even in a public health context, and with the understanding that all these things are related in a way that they can hopefully predict outcomes. So in addition to the one-on-one, and so I moved from clinical psych to public health because I thought population level interventions would get us closer to that answer. So that's another example. And so where we can't all do one-on-one, we do things in a group setting. So every other Saturday we have 60 to 100 young men we're working with, and so that's another way of providing resources, support, and really this issue of trust. And hopefully even the research says one-on-one is better, but we've also figured out that we'd rather do group and touch more young people than do one-on-one and touch less.
I just add to that when I mentioned this organization, I don't know if I mentioned it by name, but the RISE Youth Center in Richmond, I think this focus on how do you create beloved community in these organizations, which is obviously very different from the kind of intensive experience of living and being nurtured in someone's home, but sort of how do they create love in these organizations, in real relationships. I think that's something I think there's some really powerful models out there, and like I said, sometimes hard to evaluate. But it reminds me that that's also an organization that has been very clear about doing community capacity building work that isn't always participatory research. And I think today we've heard amazing work around participatory research, but also to know that maybe that's not everything has to be participatory research. I think the message is be really clear about what you're doing and why, and don't call it that if it's not. Sort of understanding the value added of doing that versus not. And it's an organization that is just starting to do YPAR, or Youth-Led Participatory Action Research, but has done a lot of youth-driven work. In fact, the whole center was formed out of a youth movement in that city. So, are there other questions? I know we're coming up on, I think, the next, yeah. Do you want?
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so 10-minute break. We'll start up again at 2:20, and I believe that there's popcorn. There's popcorn. There's popcorn. So enjoy popcorn. Come back at 2:20. We'll get started, and we'll steal some time from my final presentation.